Hello, ballers, brawlers, and bastards. My name is TBS Guy, and as we talked about in the last episode, when we were in Loot Gulain, talking a little bit about Diablo 2 and its combat system and its world building, we're returning to Diablo 1 for now to talk about the combat in this game, and talk about some of the design decisions that went into it and how that helps the feeling of the game. So, in order to do that, I think I would like to go and find the Butcher. Now, we haven't dealt with the Butcher yet on this save file, basically because I had other stuff to talk about and I wasn't really that interested, but he serves very well as an example of what I want to talk about here, and his sub-level serves as an excellent example as well, if we can find it. So, Diablo 1 is tile-based entirely. Like, everything is based on tiles. You can move in exactly 8 directions. There's no free movement. You move from one tile to the other. Enemies can occupy tiles. You can occupy tiles. But there's no smoothness to it at all. It's a very clunky combat system. And the combat, especially for the warrior, who will rarely have a lot of spells to use, basically just consists of walking up to some enemies and then hitting them in the face. And hoping that it works out. Now, originally, there's a GDC talk by one of the original designers of Diablo, where he talks about some of the design decisions that went into the game and why it was made the way it was on a technical level. He doesn't talk that much about the story or the world conception of the game, unfortunately, but it's a really good talk. If you're interested, I'm going to link to it down below. And one of the things the original Diablo was designed to be was to be a roguelike, actually. Or, well, not a direct roguelike, but inspired by rogue. It was designed to be tile-based and turn-based. And so what they did for the programming was they essentially, according to him anyway, what they did was they measured the tile size in the original XCOM, Enemy Unknown, and they basically just kind of ported that over into Diablo and used that as the tile size for this game. And he talked a lot about, like, some of the clunkiness of the programming and sort of the workarounds they had to do in order to make the game fit and in order to make it all work with the technology that they had available and so on and so forth. It's a really interesting talk because it gets to a lot of the heart of why Diablo is the way it is. But the thing I want to talk about specifically is the clunkiness of the combat system. As the warrior especially, but even as the sorcerer and the rogue, combat is a matter of stat checks. Like, it really is, especially for the warrior and the rogue, because if you don't have the stats to penetrate your enemy's defenses, then you can attack them as much as you want. You can shoot arrows, you can hit them with a sword. You're not going to do anything. You're not going to do any damage. You're not going to kill them. You have to have the stats, otherwise you have no means of fighting the enemy. And as a consequence, there's a relatively low skill expression in this game. That is to say, your individual skill as a player is not necessarily the primary thing that determines whether or not you can beat a certain area or beat a certain boss. You have to have the stats for it. Otherwise, there's absolutely no way to win, which is why we're looking for the Butcher right now, because he's a great demonstration of a point that I want to make in this video. So, if you... there's his chamber. Excellent. So one of the troubles with this mod, which I'm using because it allows me to record this screen capture footage pretty easily, and because it's just a much easier way to run the game than trying to get the old original vanilla to even work on a modern system, like that's shit. You can do it, but it causes havoc with modern graphics cards, especially if you run multiple monitors like I do. One of the troubles with it, though, is that it pumps up the number of enemies, and it changes some of the behaviors of the enemies in this game. In the original Diablo, there would be plenty of enemies to a level. It also changes some of the map layouts in the game, which is also a little bit of an issue. There would be plenty of enemies to a particular level of the cathedral, but you would generally not encounter, like, giant hordes at a time. That was one of the things that made areas like King Leoric's tomb special, and, you know, Chamber of Bone and some of the various sub-levels that you could find special, was that they tended to contain large numbers of enemies that had to be dealt with. Which is something that, over the normal course of exploring the cathedral, you would relatively rarely, especially early on, run into very large groups of enemies at a time. And if you do run into very large groups of enemies, one of the worst things that can possibly happen to you is to get surrounded. Like, the worst thing you can do in Diablo, especially as the warrior, is to just kind of charge ahead blindly and just walk into a room and be like, oh, hey, there's a lot of guys here. And then, if you would please help me, you get surrounded like this, and you can't move. And if you don't have, if you If your stats are too low, then every time an enemy hits you, you will be hit stunned, and you will be unable to strike back. And being unable to strike back, you're going to be unable to kill the enemies that surround you, which means you're going to be unable to break out of it, which means that no matter what, no matter how many potions you have, if you can't attack and you can't run away, you're going to die. And it's just a stat check. Like, it's just basically, do you have the stats to survive the assault that you are under? And that leads to a very particular type of skill correction. Like, really the only thing you can do as a player to improve your odds of winning is to be careful about your positioning, to never ever get surrounded by enemies, unless, like me in this situation, you are vastly overpowering them and they can't actually do anything to hurt you. And so one of the primary strategies you'd find, especially as the warrior, is you'd be very aware of your environment. You'd be very aware of not getting, for instance, caught up against a wall too easily. You'd also be careful about walking out in the open without exploring first. You'd be careful about doors, especially like getting caught in the middle of a doorway with enemies on both sides could be pretty bad, but the door is also one of your primary defensive options because it allows you to do this. There's a bunch of enemies in here, but so long as I've got the doorway, I can deal with either one of them at a time, or if I go forward, I can deal with up to 3 of them at a time. And that allowed you to make some decisions about how many enemies you were stat checking against at any one time, and it could help you a lot in terms of, you know, increasing your survivability, especially as the warrior. A lot of this is less true for the rogue and the wizard and the sorcerer, because they have ranged options. They have the option to just kite enemies back and shoot them and shoot them and shoot them with whatever they have available. But for the rogue especially, there's still a stat check in place here where if the rogue doesn't have the stats to penetrate enemy defenses, then it doesn't matter how many arrows she fires. It's still going to be a question of she can't hurt them, and she's going to have to run away and level up until her stats are big enough to actually take them on. With the rogue and the sorcerer, there was also you introduced the element of aiming, like, because their projectiles generally moved relatively slowly, and you had to be sensible about your aiming. This is what I've discussed in one of the previous videos, that you'd stand still, hold shift, and then just click in order to fire in a particular direction. You would try to lead enemies, you try to hit them where they were, and sometimes you could even hit enemies off screen if you were very good. But it was still very much a matter of a stat check. And the same thing goes for the sorcerer in particular. I also had a stat check in the form of his mana pool, which was... And the mana pool for the sorcerer was essentially his mana plus however many mana potions he had elected to carry with him. And in the original Diablo, you could have 8 potions, and that was it in your hotbar. You could have a lot more in your inventory, and so for a lot of sorcerers, a lot of their inventory space often was taken up by just full mana potions over and over and over again, because their mana was so important to their ability to even participate in combat. In return for that, of course, they also got...
Looks like it's rusted shut.
Okay, there's this... Okay, so as I recall, there are some levers that I have to pull here. This is cut content, I think, which was restored by the modding team. And here we are going to find the Butcher, who is one of the boss fights in the game, as it were. Let's just deal with his minions. And the Butcher is one of those places where Diablo players would usually die their first time, because they would open the door to his chamber and they would hear, "Ah, fresh meat." And then this massive thing would come running at them, which has insanely high attack speed. Which has very high attack speed and really high attack stats. And who would, as you can see here, he just wails on you. And as the warrior, unless you were like level 6, 7, or 8, you'd be unable to stand up to him in a straight fight. As the wizard, if he got close to you, you would pretty much just die in 2 hits. Probably, and the rogue, very much the same thing, because they usually didn't have the survivability to stand up to him. And even now, as I am level 14, which is way over-leveled for the situation, he was actually doing damage to me and giving me pushback, which is one of the features of the mod, that the difficulty of the guy has been pumped up a bit. He's been given some extra abilities and stuff like that. But it was just a stat check. Now, one of the major things in horror games, one of the major things that makes horror games work, and you will hear this in every analysis that you will ever hear of a game like Silent Hill 2, for example, is that in order for horror games to be scary, you, as the player, have to feel vulnerable. You have to feel like you are vulnerable to the enemies that are around you, which is why like a lot of horror protagonists just have combat mechanics that control like absolute garbage ass, because it means it's difficult for you to fight the enemies, it's difficult for you to fight back, which means it's easier to make the situation scary. Diablo 1, perhaps accidentally, capitalizes on this because the combat system is so stat checky, because it's such a binary of either you can kill the enemy or else the enemy will kill you, because you are constantly vulnerable to being surrounded, because you have so limited movement options, because you generally, especially as the warrior, but as any of the characters, have to be so cognizant of your range and your positioning at all times, you get scared. Especially as a first-time player. Like, experienced Diablo players know what to do, they know how to manage the environment around them and stuff like that, and they know how to make sure that their stats are high enough that they never get into real trouble. But you feel scared. You feel vulnerable to the enemies around you. You feel like, holy shit, if I get surrounded here, if I miss a group of enemies, I'm dead. If I don't manage it correctly, if I can't find a doorway to use, if I can't find an escape route to get away from them, I'm dead. And that feeling just doesn't really exist in Diablo 2. Certainly not for me. Because in Diablo 2, well...
my friend. Stay a while and listen.
Thank you. In Diablo 2, first of all, you don't have the tile-based system, which, that alone, just the fact that you're not restricted to just tile movement, gives you a million times more movement options than you have in Diablo 1. Like, it's incredibly much easier to just move around and choose your positioning and avoid getting surrounded and locked down. Like, they also changed the way that hit stun works in that particular game, in the sense that you rarely get caught out by getting surrounded by enemies, and then every time they hit you, you become unable to move away and leave. There's still some of that, but certainly for me as a player, even as a new player of Diablo 2, that was a much less common experience for me than it is in Diablo 1, where literally, if an enemy is attacking you and you try to walk away, you can, if you get hit while you're in the walking animation, you'll literally get warped back to the tile that you were standing on when you got hit. And so you could get a situation where you were just kind of trying to walk away, and you kept getting warped back to the tile in front of the enemy. And they never interrupted, like, you trying to move away did not interrupt their attack speed, it did not interrupt their flow or their animations. They would just keep wailing on you, and you would keep being unable to walk away from them, which is one of the ways that the Butcher would often try and kill you. All of that has been reduced substantially in Diablo 2, because the game, at least from a design standpoint, seems to be much more about making the player feel empowered, making the player feel powerful. And so, for that reason, the number of enemies has been pumped up substantially. Like, you don't no longer encounter 4 or 5 or 6 fallen ones while you're walking around in the labyrinth. You encounter a whole horde of fallen ones, and a shaman who keeps reviving the fallen ones as you fight your way across this broad, grand, open field. You're not in a claustrophobic environment. You can always run away. You can always escape. You can always keep your distance. You can always get away from them. And you always have options. Like, even the paladin, even the ostensible melee characters like the paladin and the barbarian have a lot of options for closing the gap on enemies, or indeed closing the gap away from enemies to get away from enemies that are too powerful for them to deal with. And so you are much more empowered as a player in Diablo 2, which is something we might be able to take a look at in another video. And in Diablo 3, this is ramped up way the hell even more. And in fact, why are we even here? Let's go down to the catacombs. In Diablo 3, this is ramped up way the hell even more, because you are not only a powerful adventurer, you are a Nephilim, one of the powerful mythical beings who can destroy the entire hordes of hell, and you're fighting literal armies of enemies with, like, spell effects going off everywhere, and hundreds of enemies dying, and you have kill streaks of 18, 20, 30, 40 enemies to get experience bonuses. Like, this is much more of an arcade experience, which on its own is not a bad thing, but it's a very, very different feeling as a player from being in a situation here where it's like, okay, here's a few enemies, I could deal with them so long as they're not too many of them, so long as it's one at a time. And now I'm in an area that's somewhat more level appropriate for me. You can see I'm having more trouble just hitting these enemies because my stat check is low. My stat check isn't as good compared to theirs, which introduces a lot more tension. And especially when I'm dealing with these hornet demons, which are actually enemies from the next tile set in the game. You can see as the overlords start filing in through the door that I opened, because I did a bad job of scouting the area before I walked into this room. That's the kind of little mistake that can get you in trouble in this game, that can get you saddled with a lot of damage. And that's like in Diablo 2, that feeling, this feeling of being alone and being isolated, because there are no companions in Diablo 1. In Diablo 1, you are always in the labyrinth alone. You can't summon anything. You can't summon anyone. The only summoning spell there is you might remember this from the sorceress in Diablo 2, which is a summoning spell. You summon a Hydra that just, oh boy, you can see what I mean, right, about being surrounded? I need the Horned Demon to die. Okay. Oh boy. And he's got lifesteal too, that's great. This is something the mod has added, by the way. Enemies like that were not present in the original Diablo, but it was a good demonstration of the kind of trouble that you can get in the original Diablo if you get surrounded, is that I was trapped in that room. There was no other way out. I had to fight my way through them. If I had moved away from the door, and like both of those enemies had been able to get around me and surround me and attack me, I would have been in deep shit. Like I would have been fucked. I would have been dead right there. Because I did a bad job of scouting the area before. Theoretically, this is the worst possible way I could play this, because I'm not scouting the area at all before I'm unlocking these rooms and these enemies. But that's not a worry I would ever have in Diablo 2. Like, I don't think I would ever have to have that concern in Diablo 2, or have that worry about, oh, shit, am I doing a good enough job of, getting around this stuff? I don't think I would ever have to have that worry. Now, here in Diablo 1 Vanilla, when I unlock this last bit of the Blood Pedestal, the area in front of me is going to open up, and there's going to be Horned Demons at the end of it. And the Horned Demons have an ability where they can charge at you from a distance, which means all of a sudden when you open this, 2 or 3 of them are just going to come charging the hell right at you and do a lot of contact damage as they hit you. Not the case in the mod. Again, I think this is some cut content, but in the mod, you fight this guy instead, who uses player abilities against you. And last time I fought him, he kicked my ass completely, and I couldn't actually beat him. I wonder if I'm going to fare any better here. Because I don't think he has a mana pool. I think he has infinite mana, actually, and he has the ability to heal himself. But you can see there, one of my attacks actually managed to interrupt his casting animation, which gave me a fair chance of fighting back, which is the thing that can happen to you. That was his healing spell. Okay, I think I have the stat check to deal with him. If he doesn't keep healing like a bitch. Die. Yes! Thank God. Okay.
May the spirit of Arcane protect me.
There we go. And that's what the combat system in Diablo 1 is very much like. It is tense. It is difficult, and it is like when you encounter an enemy that you haven't seen before, you don't know if you have the stat check to be able to take it down. You don't know if you're even going to be able to duel them or deal with them. It's always a tense situation when you see a new enemy that you haven't dealt with before, when you see a new elite that you haven't dealt with before. It's, holy shit, is this guy just going to be able to tear me apart, or am I actually going to be able to fight back? Without that tension, Diablo 2 becomes a very different game, and that's something that bleeds over into the entire rest of the series, which is something, as we've already discussed, the first game is much more simple, it's much more localized, it's much more personal, it's much more small in scope. And as the scope gets bigger and bigger and bigger into the other 2 games, the power creep gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you become able to deal with larger and larger hordes of enemies. You become able to do more and more things, and the more shit you can do, the less vulnerable you feel, the less scared you get. And because the game can no longer get its hooks, like the appeal of the game is no longer that you are traveling through a dangerous labyrinth with scary enemies around every turn. The appeal of the game becomes you are an unstoppable warrior carving a path through endless hordes of monsters, killing everything you see on every single side, and no one can stop you. No one can stand against you. You are the legendary Nephilim. You will, assault the gates of heaven and the very gates of the burning hells, and you will kill all of the Satans. Just all 3 Satans and all the little mini Satans. You're going to kill all of them, and you're going to destroy them, and you're going to be the most powerful dude who has ever been in the entire universe. Very different feeling. And for me, at least, as a guy who came up with the original Diablo, who's a fan of the original Diablo,
Stay a while and listen.
it's not a change for the better. Like, this is the game that I fell in love with. this is the game that got me hooked on Diablo, that got me hooked on the feeling of this game.
What can I do for you?
And Diablo 2, I loved it as well because it was the bigger and better game that I thought I wanted back then. But Diablo 3 especially, every part of it, the way that it's designed, every part of the way that it's supposed to empower the player, all the grandiosity and all the sort of globe-trotting, swashbuckling, tomb-raiding adventure that it injects, all of it is a step away from this feeling. From this feeling of being a lone adventurer, trapped in many cases in the labyrinth, knowing that you have to get to the bottom in order to save this town, and these characters who you do come to care about over the course of the game, but also knowing every time you descend into another level, there's a decent chance that whatever you run into will be able to destroy you, will be able to kill you, and you will not be able to do very much about that at all. Which makes the whole endeavor, to me at least, in this game, I feel a lot more like a hero. I feel a lot more like someone who's doing something despite the danger, despite the fear, despite the tension, despite the risk of death, despite the risk of destruction. It feels a lot more like, in this game, I'm acting heroically, not really in my own best self-interest. Because again, in this game, it's never really clear in this game that, when you play the game itself at least, that Diablo is like a threat to the entire world. Like, he's dangerous and he's terrible, and, you know, burning hells, he's one of the lords of hell and stuff like that, but it's not in the same way that it is in Diablo 3 and 2 and 3. It's not really clear that, oh, he's a threat to the entire world, you are saving the entire world. No, you're saving this town. You're saving this town from destruction. You're saving Tristram. You're saving Ogden and Griswold and Cain. And that feeling is gone in Diablo 2 and 3, and with it, much of what I think made the series special to me back when it started. And I know that this is nostalgia glasses. Like, this is all tinged by an old man looking back at the games he played when he was young and going, back in my day, we did not have all these fancy combat options, no. We had to fight the enemy uphill both ways in the snow with one mouse button, and damn it, we were happy. Kids today are spoiled. That's part of it. I recognize that completely. But I also think that it's true that Diablo 2, and especially Diablo 3, aren't really interested in being continuations of this game. They're not really interested in being more of this. They're interested in being more of something ultimately completely different. Anyway, in the next episode, I think we will finally dive into Diablo 3, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the dungeon designs and the visual design of that game, and some of the ways in which the ways that game's presented from a visual level helps distance it further from what it was back in Diablo 1. If you've enjoyed this video, you can click the subscribe button down below. There's also a like button. You can comment, and all of that is very helpful because of metrics or something. I mean, at this point, I'm willing to accept it. If someone at YouTube told me that I could get more views by sacrificing a goat at midnight while swinging a dead cat over my head, I'd probably, honestly, I'd be, yeah, well, I guess that's the algorithm, now I'm just gonna do that. But anyway, if you want to help me with having my videos show up as the algorithm is right now, well, feel free to hit those buttons and give me those statistics, because they're nice. If you have not enjoyed this video, of course, that's completely okay as well. There's a dislike button down below that you can click on, although I should warn you that if you click on it, you may find that over the course of time, you will cease to value the same things that you once valued. You will cease to have the same principles in mind when you go about your business, and one day you will look yourself in the mirror and find someone who's shinier, nicer, grander, stronger, and perhaps in some ways better, but who has lost some of that original spark, some of that original magic that made them so special back in the day. And you're going to wonder to yourself, where did it all go? How did it all go wrong? And you're going to look down on your phone, and you're going to find that you have downloaded Diablo Immortal, and you're playing it, and you're having fun. You really are. You're having so much fun. Oh, by the way, I also have a Patreon. I think I forgot to mention that. If you want to support that, that's also, thanks.